Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I want the truth!
Why don't you answer him?
Welcome to another episode of Objection Your Fiction. I'm really excited for today's episode. We're going to be talking about for those who don't know, I'm a little bit of a fantasy nerd. I've read all of the Game of Thrones books, but unfortunately they're not complete yet. Watched the entire series. I've watched every show. I've read many of the prequel series, and we're thrilled to have with us today to talk about Knight of the Seven Kingdoms and some other Games of Thrones-esque stuff. Dr. Christina Bruno. Dr. Bruno is the Associate Director of Fordham Center for Medieval Studies and a scholar of canon law. I mean, medievalism, I can't even say that word. I didn't say it right.
It's okay. Medievalism, yeah.
We can probably spend the whole podcast trying to get me to say that word. I don't think
it's tough.
It would happen. We're going to unpack all of the justice, trials, punishments, power structures that we have seen in the Game of Thrones universe. But first off, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
I guess, why don't we start, for those who don't know what medieval law is? I think probably many people think of Game of Thrones as medieval, what they see in Game of Thrones as medieval law. Is that right? What is medieval law? What are kind of the misconceptions about?
So I'm very glad that you asked that question, because I think that people have this sort of stereotypical view of the Middle Ages as a time that's lawless, as a time that's chaotic, it's very violent. And there was violence, there's no getting around that, but it is also, the Middle Ages was a society that was sort of shot through with different kinds of law that sort of overlap and jostle against each other, all kinds of different rights and privileges and traditions that medieval people were very aware of and could sort of navigate between. They could sort of choose the law that they wanted to in some cases. So yeah, I mean, as in Game of Thrones, there is royal law, although how effective that was and how well enforced that was varies greatly across the Middle Ages and across geographically. There is also, of course, which is something we don't see so much in Game of Thrones and Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, although a little bit, the law of the church. In medieval Europe, that's canon law. It emanates occasionally from the Pope, but really from church structures, from bishops' councils, things like that. And it governs certain types of offenses and areas of life. I mean, the closest we see in Game of Thrones is actually like Cersei's trial and the whole episode with the sparrows. But there's also urban law, customary law, laws that govern, particular cities or protected bodies. So there's a lot of different kinds of law across the Middle Ages.
Were there... So let's take the church law or canon law and then royal law. Was there overlap? Is there a hierarchy of laws? Does one, if let's say you're in violation of both, does one supersede the other? How did that work?
So most dramatically, I mean, when people think of that, you think of Thomas of Becket and Henry II, where there's benefit of clergy, which is sort of the thing that's at issue there, where if you are a cleric or if you're affiliated with the church in some way, even in a very minor way, you can be entitled to be tried in ecclesiastical courts, which is preferable for some offenses because there is no corporal or capital punishment in ecclesiastical venues. So people will do their best to try to, be tried under ecclesiastical auspices whenever they can. On the other hand, there are some crimes that can only be adjudicated by, say, a pope or a king in his land. So things like keeping the peace, disputes between, property disputes, things like that. The church law can do almost everything the royal or secular law can do, but there are some things that the church law can do that secular law cannot.
So I guess let's talk about the Game of Thrones universe, big picture, without getting into details. I'm just kind of curious. There's not a lot of, we talked about this before we started, there's not a lot of civil disputes that are adjudicated in the Game of Thrones universe. They're kind of touched on. It's more criminal law. How realistic is what's depicted on the various TV shows from a criminal law standpoint. And I guess related question, what part of the Middle Ages is most closely analogous to what we're seeing on screen?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, I think they're certainly going for sort of later medieval, at least in look, sort of like 13th century, maybe 12th, 13th century, what we think of as like the High Middle Ages. In terms of the actual law that you see, though, it's variable. So, I mean, the chief thing that you see there with trial by battle, which is like the penultimate episode, you get that, very dramatic trial by battle. That did happen during the Middle Ages, but it happened much more infrequently after about 1300. So this is something that's sort of ordeal as a means of justice evolved from being like a legal thing to being more of a chivalric thing. So, and there's a lot of overlap between those two, the sort of informal code of behavior that governed what makes a good knight, what makes a bad knight, how they should or should not behave, versus like an actual judicial process. So, I mean, like Ridley Scott's The Last Duel is another example of this. That's a real duel that happened in the middle of the 14th century. And that was...
That's the Adam Driver movie. I don't think I ever saw that one.
The Adam Driver movie. Rashomon is better. I mean, it's Adam Driver's fine, but like, it did happen, but it was exceptional for it to happen. So
how did it happen? Was there like judicial discretion to permit it if requested, which is kind of what happens in some variation of what happens in the show? I mean, you have a right to it on the show. I guess if you're a knight or a noble, you have a right to it. Otherwise, off with your head.
There's not like, peasants being like, I demand trial by battle kind of thing.
I'm sure they could say it, but they probably
wouldn't get it, right? So the way that works is that scholars write about how so duel is only one form of ordeal. There are actually a number of other kinds of ordeals, but duel is what's called trial. Well, I mean, it's more like what's on the tin, trial by combat. But an ordeal is so a duel is a bilateral ordeal, which means that you have two parties who are contesting this issue and they're fighting each other. But there are also unilateral ordeals that are used much more frequently. So these are things like in the American context, we're actually very familiar with, if you've ever read or heard about the witch trials, ordeal by cold water, which is being dumped in the water and seeing if the water sort of like rejects you, in which case you're innocent or you sink. In the Middle Ages, much more common was something like the ordeal of hot water, where you have a boiling cauldron with like a small object at the bottom that you have to reach in and grab. And then they wrap up your hand, and that because you're going to get burned, obviously. 3 days later, they check if your wound is healing or festering. And if it's healing, you're innocent. And if it's festering, you're not. So all of these...
If it's festering, you die anyway, right? So it's
probably. Yeah, things are not looking good for you at that point. And actually, that brings up a good point, which is that I think like in the American context, again, with the witch trials, we tend to think of like, like drowning the witches is like a form of punishment. But at least in its theoretical form, it's not a form of punishment. It's a form of proof or, proof. So...
Which is, I guess, kind of similar to like, well, the language in Night of the Seven Kingdoms and Game of Thrones, the gods will decide whether or not you're innocent based on the outcome of...
Indeed, yeah. The medieval term the Latin term for ordeal is judicium Dei, so it's the judgment of God. And battles were actually, like between armies, were also considered to be a form of ordeal, that this was sort of like God will decide who is the victor, who is the just. But
I think even more recent wars, we've heard some invocations.
Certainly, yes. I mean, which you kind of do at your peril because like no one knows what's going to happen once the war starts. But the point of the way that the duel comes about, and scholars have written about how ordeal is much more present in medieval records as something that is proposed and then not gone through with. Actually, it's sort of like almost a bargaining chip. Like an ordeal is sort of a last resort where all other methods of proof or negotiation or agreement have failed, because all of these things are like physically very unpleasant to go through, like whether you're fighting a duel or you're burning your hand or you're getting dunked in water. So if there is any other way than to do the ordeal, you're going to try to do that. So by that token, when trial by battle does happen, it's generally in a political situation where there is a need for a public spectacle that sort of decides something one way or another. However, as on Night of the Seven Kingdoms, once you have that sort of public spectacle, it's very easy for that to backfire. Because it's out of the control of once it starts happening, it's out of anyone's control really, other than the combatants.
And you see that in the trial of the Seven, where the crowd begins to kind of turn on the Targaryens over the course of the battle.
Yeah, but arguably, and I mean, I was thinking this as I was like taking notes for this podcast, but like arguably the fact that it got to the duel in the first place is an expression of discontent with the Targaryens, because if the Targaryens were super popular, none of this would ever have happened. I mean, there would have been no question that Dunk was guilty, and like, the crowd would have just taken him apart. But in this case, because there's this sort of like, well, Aerion has, the reputation of being this sort of brutal, I mean, frankly, kind of psychotic.
And there were witnesses to it also, so it's not like it happened in private and he can deny it. What happened. It almost was. There was no question of fact, right? Yeah. It was just a question of whether or not Dunk was permitted to intervene in what was going on.
No, I mean, the thing about that also that I thought was interesting was that it's not just a trial by battle, but it's a trial. So it's the trial of 7 on the show where each side has to produce.
I'm guessing no parallel to that in. Oh, right.
So there is a parallel.
You're raising your finger. So
there is a parallel.
This is a shocking tournament.
Yeah, I mean, so not exactly. I mean, there is no battle with
7 people. Put 7 people put their hands in boiling water, and whoever festers.
No, but there is a tradition, especially in urban law, of something called compurgation, which is so if you are required to make an oath on something contentious, depending on who you are, what your status is, what the oath is, you may be required to produce compurgators or oath helpers to help your oath.
Okay.
To give it force. So they're kind of like character witnesses, where these are people who are going to testify to your good name and your trustworthiness and all of that. But ironically, and this is why Aerion proposes the trial by 7, is that he thinks, well, Dunk isn't going to be able to find 6 people to fight with him because nobody knows him, because he's poor, because of all these things. Aerion, because he is, he's the prince and he's wealthy, he can like compel or bribe people to fight for him, but
and turn people who had pledged to fight for Dunk
right
to the other side as well.
Right. So it sort of penalizes people who are unknown, who have fewer resources, and this is precisely how it was intended to work.
Sounds very similar to our present justice system.
This is how it's intended to work. Yeah. It's the more unknown you are, the more other people are required to vouch for you. And I think actually Night of the Seven Kingdoms does a nice job of setting that up throughout the show. It's all about sort of like who remembers you, who can you find to vouch for you, and that sort of determines who you are and what you can do.
Right. Yeah. So it sounds like there was at least kind of comparable trial by combat in the early Middle Ages. Did it play out very similarly to the trial by combat that we see in the Game of Thrones universe, where if one side wins and that side is the accuser, the other side is found guilty. If the accused wins, they're deemed not guilty. Is that generally how it would?
That's generally how it goes. It's so again, it was exceptional that it would sort of get to that point. And later in the Middle Ages, you do see these things happening in more sort of controlled circumstances. Like in tournaments, there were, single combat occasionally in tournaments, but this was not sort of a judicial application. But yeah, I mean, and these were generally a judicial duel was you were fighting essentially to the death at that point. Like this wasn't like whoever falls over first. This was like
were you permitted to rescind your claim like Aerion does?
This is precisely what happens. Yeah. Okay. So you have to, if you're beaten into submission and you withdraw your claim, then the duel ends.
Or your eyes get ripped out, like over in Martell.
I don't know how Dunk still has an eye after the duel, because doesn't he get something like jammed in his helmet?
Is it confirmed that he still has an eye? He looks in pretty bad shape.
Well, I think he just had a black eye, like it was just closed, and then doesn't he have an eye in the end of the? I don't know.
I don't remember. Maybe I
don't remember. I thought he had 2 eyes.
He's in pretty rough shape by the end of.
I do like that at the end everyone is limping. Like every character is limping.
I think Baelor is probably in the worst shape at the end of the episode.
Well, he's yes, indeed.
How I guess let's take a step back for a second and talk about the tournament itself, and Dunk's quest to enlist support to be involved in the tournament. So, were these highly desirable tournaments to engage in? Did you have knights or questionable knights like taking painstaking effort to get involved in them? Like, what was the reality of these types of tournaments?
So this is where the chronology gets kind of muddled in like what is shown on screen. So this kind of tournament is a very late medieval development. So I mean, well, sort of 13th century, 14th century, 15th century, where the idea of knighthood is really sort of crystallizing into, it's about your lineage. It's about, your background. A knight has to be sort of the son of knights, and then that makes him a knight. So it becomes, as the Middle Ages goes on, it becomes much harder for someone to break into knighthood. The other thing is that it's very expensive to be a knight. I mean, the show does a good job of showing that like he can't even get armor because he has no money. Right. So the training is expensive, all of that.
That's why his shield like falls apart in 1 second, because he has his crummy shields.
Right, exactly. So the only reason that he has horses is because he inherited them from his former master.
And because there happened to be a lot of kind people around him somehow.
Well, and because he's an inherently good person. So this is actually what the show does a good job of showing, is that, the idea of chivalry, which is something that we hear, like we think of like, I don't know, like men opening doors for women, and that's chivalry. But chivalry was much bigger than that. It had to do with...
For me, it's picking the takeout order on a Friday night.
Exactly.
If I do that,
that's chivalrous. I mean, it is, and that's behavior that should be encouraged. No, chivalry was about sort of inward nobility. It was about prowess in battle first and foremost. I mean, it's like rooted in the fact that this is their function in society, is to fight battles. But it's not enough to just be a great warrior. You also have to have sort of largesse. You have to have loyalty to your companions and to your lord. You have to show mercy. There are sort of guardrails around the violence that you are allowed to express, which is why when you see a character like Arion, who is a prince, but he's also a knight, he is engaging in behavior that everyone around him sees is not the right behavior to be engaging in.
Including his dad and his
They
uncle.
all know that he's, like, even his family knows that he's bad news.
Right.
And that's because he is sort of violating this knightly code. So in terms of why people would want to fight in the tournament, so tournaments emerge as kind of like a place to show off your chivalry, to like perform chivalry, essentially. So it's not just that you have to win. It's that your behavior has to be courteous and merciful, and the violence that you enact, and that there was a lot of violence, has to be according to these very specific guidelines.
The guidelines that I guess are like codified by custom, right? They're not...
Yeah, I mean, it's behavior that evolves over time. There is like a dramatic moment early on in the Middle Ages, in like the end of the 10th century. It's something called the peace movement, or sometimes the peace intrusive God movement, where this is mostly led, as the name suggests, by churchmen who try to get knights and lords to agree that, for example, they will not attack non-combatants. They won't attack women and children. They won't burn fields, so that there's no harvest. They won't attack clergymen. They won't, so again, like defending the weak. And this is enforced by excommunication at that point. But this is something that takes off also because, and this is another thing that I think Martin does so brilliantly in the books and on the show, is that this type of behavior is spread through stories and songs, and the stories that the people in this world tell themselves about how they should behave. So they're looking at, tales of great knights and saying like, I want to be like that. I don't want to be like the villain. Right. So yeah, all of this knightly behavior is being modeled both through the tournaments and then also through songs and stories. But so tournaments were also, though, I mean, like, one of the reasons that Dunk wants to do it is that he wants to win so that he can, like, be financially solvent. So there's very famous...
Is that what you think? My takeaway was that
that's part of it.
I guess maybe that's the subtext, because I don't know that that's ever explicitly...
Well, at the beginning, he's talking to his horses, because I love that he has these continual conversations with his horses.
It's like a Disney movie.
But he says, like, if I sell you guys, I could eat for like 3 years and I'd be great. But then like I'm gonna have to.
But then I'm done after 3 years. Like I'm finished.
Yeah. So I mean, he enters the tournament because he needs to this is the only kind of life that he knows how to lead. This is how he knows to make his living. And so the most famous example of a knight like this is William.
By the way, you get it appears that even just by like going to where the tournament is held, you eat for free and drink for free.
Well, it's like Las Vegas. It's like you go and you show up at the table, but they do expect you to. So
to play eventually.
Lionel Baratheon, who is like probably my secret favorite character in the show.
He's the best.
He steals every scene that he's in, and it's just like he's like, "Why are you in my tent?" It's like he's hungry. Yeah. So I mean, there is like these are great feasts, parties. It would, in theory, be possible for like a stranger to sort of sneak in. And
Dunk was a stranger, right?
Right. Yeah. So so there are examples of sort of famous tournament knights. William Marshall is maybe the most famous. He dies in 1219. And he was the tutor of Richard the Lionheart. So he was like the master at arms. But in his youth, he was sort of a second son. He didn't have a lot of prospects, and he made his name because he was such a great warrior as a tourney knight. So he would win and win and win and win. And then what happens, as the show illustrates, when you win, your opponent has to give you, his horse, his armor, and then he has to ransom them back if he wants them back, which is why it's such high stakes for Dunk in Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, because he has no money to ransom anything. So one loss is really it for him.
Right.
But William Marshall, he amassed like a fortune by just being a really good knight. So it was possible to do that if you were good.
Mm-hmm.
But again, because of the training that was required to get to that level, it was primarily like an elite concern. So something like Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, or like A Knight's Tale, which essentially the Heath Ledger movie, which is essentially like, this is an extended version of that almost. It's like implausible, but I guess theoretically possible.
That actually leads me to a question that I was thinking of before, which is, it's pretty clear that like, I'm trying to remember who's the knight that Dunk serves. What's his name? Arlen?
Arlen. Yeah, Sir Arlen.
So the manner in which Arlen fights, and now the manner in which Dunk fights, which we've now seen for the first time.
As a hedge knight. Yeah.
As a hedge knight, episode 5, because we hadn't seen him really fight up until episode 5. We were left to wonder, like, does he even know how?
Yeah, he's probably not very good. He's just huge.
He fights like Arlen.
Yeah.
It's just like this unrelenting, not quitting, brutal, by any means necessary. Would that have, let's say he was competing in that manner in the tournament itself. This is different because he was fighting for his life. Would that would he basically be disqualified as being viewed as a knight by virtue of how he comported himself?
That's an interesting question. I mean, and I'm sure there are like military experts who would have more to say on this than I do, but like, I think that, I mean, style does come into it, I guess, but so does winning. I think it's less likely that he would get to the point where he would be able to compete. And in fact, he never actually gets to the point where he's able to compete because the duel sort of intervenes.
Yeah, and he kills off the king in waiting by accident.
Sorry. Poor guy. Yeah, that was rough.
Yes, it was a tough episode for all of us. So let's suppose for a second that there was a standard trial and they didn't invoke trial by combat or trial by the seven. How would that trial proceed? Would there be flickers? I mean, we don't really see a real trial with witnesses, I think, at all in Game of Thrones, because every time there's,
other than maybe Cersei's trial.
Yeah. But are there witnesses in that trial? It's really isn't it just the head faith talking for a while?
I can't remember. Yeah.
I don't know that there's like, there are like witnesses and cross-examination, like opening statements.
So in inquisitorial trials, that absolutely does happen, although it doesn't happen sort of live the way that we think of it in an American courtroom, where with both sides sitting, and listening. There were, I mean, if you look at inquisitorial documents that survive now, they're just like sheaves of depositions of witnesses. But ultimately, the sort of the idea in American justice that you get to know who your accuser is, that was something that didn't exist in Inquisition. You didn't get to know the identity of your accuser. But there was, I mean, a similar type of like evidence gathering and weighing eyewitness testimony and sort of amassing evidence that way. But in terms of the trials that you see in Game of Thrones, those are like you say, they're generally criminal trials, and like if for example, like they hadn't done the trial by battle for the dispute between Aerion and Dunk. Yeah, I mean, I think they would have spoken to witnesses. But the type of justice that gets meted out there, I think, is more a function, again, of the political situation where nobody actually really likes the Targaryens, or at least the Targaryen who is accused. So that opens the door to even, Baelor saying, like, you can request trial by combat. Like, that's your best option.
Mm.
Yeah.
So if there was, I'm trying to remember now, did Tyrion have an actual trial first and then afterwards he invokes trial by combat?
I just thought of that. I don't remember.
I tend to remember like Tyrion like advocating for himself.
Because doesn't his uncle run the trial? Like Kevin? Uncle
Kevin?
Kevin?
He has an A in his name.
Oh, Kevin.
So, Kevin?
Yeah.
I think he did. And I think something goes awry and
well, he winds up as, well, wait.
We should have done our homework on this before we got here.
I wouldn't have had time anyway.
There are crazy Game of Thrones fans listening to this podcast
that are like,
who are like, you don't know the answer.
I don't know the answer
to this.
I don't know the answer. I'm so sorry.
Tyrion, by the way, would have been a great attorney, obviously.
Yes. Yeah. There are a few great talkers on Game of Thrones for sure.
Including probably Egg.
Yeah,
seems
Egg
like
would be great.
It seems like he's a lawyer in waiting.
Yeah, although he would never, I mean, as a Prince of the Blood, he would never have a legal career. That was like a middle class thing.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, he might study law, but he wouldn't work as a lawyer for sure.
Okay. But nobles are permitted to go to the Sept, so that's an alternative career path to becoming a king.
Right. Well, and in fact, his older brother, who we don't meet in Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, is Maester Aemon.
He's already there.
Yeah, he's already at the wall, I think.
He's at the wall, or I think he's actually at...
Isn't it, I think it's Darren, so the drunk one, and then Aerion.
They just call him the drunk one.
He's my favorite, actually. I like him a lot. But yeah, there's Darren.
He causes all these problems to begin with.
Yeah, he does, but it's also kind of not his fault. Anyway, so there's Darren, and then Aerion, and then Aemon, I think. So Aemon is the closest in age to Egg.
Aemon is already at the Sept, I believe.
Well, I thought he was already not at the Sept, at Citadel.
At the Citadel.
Yeah.
The Citadel.
Right.
I think he's a maester in training at that point.
Right. I don't know at what point he goes to the wall, though.
Well, he's around for a long time.
Right.
So, because I think this is 90 years before Game of Thrones, so he makes it well into his hundreds.
Right. Yeah, he's an old dude. I forget how we got on that, but yes. So that is like, that's an option, but not for people who are and this is like the whole drama of that branch of the Targaryen family, is that they're not supposed to inherit at all, because there are, like, Egg is so far down the line of succession that's why he becomes Egg on the unlikely. But you would never have like your first son do that, but you might have like a second, third son do that.
Right. I guess one more question on the Seven Kingdoms. So the way that now we're really spoiling, but the way that it plays out, Dunk wins.
Mm-hmm.
He pretty badly hurts Aerion. Baelor dies. This is supposed to be like a fun little trip for the Targaryens, like view a tournament, and like the entire future of Westeros has been been thrown into upheaval. I'm sure you can't answer this definitively, but if something similar to this were to have happened in the Middle Ages during a time where trial by combat was used, would Dunk really have walked away scot-free?
Again, I think it's a function of how much
public opinion
did not favor the Targaryens at that stage. And we get that like throughout the show. They're setting up that, like, even from the puppet show to
they're not feared in the same way that they were before, also is the other part.
Right. I mean, and part of that, there's no dragons, but it's also that, like, through figures like Aerion, their reputation has suffered. That they're already starting to get that reputation that, like, they're crazy, that there's something wrong with the Targaryens.
Well, they get Joffrey soon. That's much better than...
He's not even a Targaryen, which is also a spoiler. But, like, yeah, it's
well, I guess it's not... There's no Targaryen blood in the Lannisters, right?
No.
There's not.
Well, and he's a pure Lannister.
He's a pure Lannister.
Right. He's not a Baratheon. I'm forgetting my Game of Thrones history here. Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, it's a function of how unpopular the Targaryens were. Is that explains the whole sweep of the later part of the season.
While you're here, and I have one question about Joffrey and
Oh,
kind of the
sure.
inciting incident in Game of Thrones, which is Ned's death and Joffrey's decision to do it. And there was at that point, she was I was Joffrey the king, or was he too young and Cersei was
I
the
think
queen
he was the
regent?
king, but you can be a king and have a regent. I
Mm.
mean, if you're
So would he have the power to do what he did at the end of the first season of Game of Thrones if his entire council was advising against him? He was obviously a very young king.
Yeah.
It was something that I thought about for a while after it happened. Like, the executioner stood down.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if he had the authority to do it then, like in Game of Thrones speak. Like, I mean, I think that it's a function of the fact that you had this like psychotic 12-year-old on the platform.
And people were cheering for it.
Well, and you had an executioner who was willing to do it as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean,
had some bloodlust in that strut to the podium.
But it also, I mean, it has to do with public opinion. And like, it's been a long time since I even watched the first season of Game of Thrones. But like, I think Ned Stark is at a point where he is unpopular because he has been the hand of the king through like
That's true.
this, the series of unfortunate events of the first season. So he doesn't have, outside of, his own house, he doesn't have a lot of people who are supporting him.
Yeah.
Right.
It's crazy how much public opinion infiltrates legal decision making, even in the show, and it sounds like in the Middle Ages, and that's still the case today, and it probably will be the case forever.
Well, so like a nice example of this is that one of the most important, I sort of referred to this when we were talking about oath helpers, but like one of the most important things that determined what you, like what options were open to you was the sort of amorphous concept of your fama. So your fama, it's a Latin word. It's like it looks like the word fame. The literal translation is something like reputation, but it's more than that. It's something that can be damaged. I mean, it's where we get like defamation from. Yeah. So that's something that you can absolutely sue someone for defamation. But in the Middle Ages, there's the sense that your fama, if it's damaged, it must be restored to its pristine state, in order for justice to be served. So, yeah, that really, that's at the heart of whether your oath is enough, and ultimately practically like whether you get your head chopped off by a psychotic 12-year-old or not. I mean, and who is willing to stand for you, and who knows you, who remembers you, and who is willing to stand with you.
Yeah. Well, that I think is a good place to end the discussion about Game of Thrones. I had one more question though, which was, when I was doing a little bit of research for this, I came across a few articles that talked about pop culture set in the medieval times is kind of seen through the prism of the Renaissance, because that's when it was first written about. Is that true? Like we talked about A Knight's Tale, Game of Thrones, all the kind of modern depictions of medieval times. Is that a fair way to view it, or is it a mixed bag? Does it depend on the...
I mean, I think it's true that today when we call something medieval, it's like never a compliment, like it's not like, oh, how medieval, like no. So there is
like
definitely
when Samuel
this,
Jackson says, I'm going to go medieval.
this is an obviously negative sort of like barbaric, horrible association. So I think that's very true. But I do think, so for example, in Night of the Seven Kingdoms, one of my favorite moments is in like, I think it's the first episode, but it's where Dunk is like trying to get the Master of Games to let him participate. And, the guy is like, well, you're not an oath breaker, are you? Because you know what we do to oath breakers. And he starts describing this like elaborate torture device.
Yeah.
And then he just starts laughing because he's just like messing with Dunk. He's like, of course we don't do that. Like, that's totally barbaric. And I think
that's like a meta commentary.
This is a very meta commentary on like what people expect the Middle Ages to look like.
And only like you understood the joke.
I was laughing. I was laughing for sure.
Your students, I guess, too. I understood.
I hope they do. But yeah, I hope if I've said anything, it's that like there were many laws in the Middle Ages, and they were actually, I mean, reasonably well known, well enforced, and people sort of knew that law existed to protect them and to to advance their rights wherever possible.
Well, without that, there would have just been chaos.
Right. And it wasn't.
You had
Every
some
once in a
body of
while.
law, and you had the church, and that kept people in good enough
Mhm.
discipline, I guess.
Mhm.
Well, this is great. You have to come back for the second season.
Oh, yeah.
Well, if people want to find out more about your classes, what you do, where should they go? Can they check you out on social media?
So, I have, let's see. You could list my email address for sure. I actually don't have social media.
Okay, well, that's good.
But I have a Substack. So I have a Substack which I'm about to restart.
Promote the Substack.
I
Let's hear
will.
it.
So I write a Substack, Medievalish, which is I'm trying to review every movie about the Middle Ages that was made during the 1980s. I've made it to 1982 so far.
And so where can they find your Substack? Just Google.
Yeah, so it's Medievalish. Yeah.
We should definitely check it out. Are you going to eventually get to the Night of the Seven Kingdoms stuff, or no?
I think I'm gonna try to make it out of the 1980s first.
Okay. Got a while to go till you get.
Yeah, there's almost 200 movies actually. Which
oh my!
Is,
all right. Well, when find your Substack. There's a lot going on there, and we appreciate you coming on so much. Thanks. This was great.
Thank you so much.
For more on all things real estate and the law, subscribe to this and our other podcasts. Follow Bergstein, Flynn, Knowlton, and Polina on social media. Subscribe to our newsletter and go to bfklawoffice.com. That's bfklawoffice.com to learn more.